Welcome back to another live stream. We've got Mike Radzicki and Steve Keen with us today. We're going to talk about minimum wage policy. Does it help workers or does it hurt workers, I guess, would be the case. I'm going to put it out there right at the start. I'm for it, but maybe Mike isn't. Maybe Steve isn't. Who knows? Stay tuned.
You are now relearning economics.
Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell so we're together forever. Join us in the chat if you have questions. Put a Q in front of the question or question in front of the question. And then I'll bookmark your question and we can get it answered live during the stream. If you're joining in after this live, well, you can put questions underneath the video as comments. I will try to get to them. I wanted to talk about minimum wage policy today. I made an offhand post on Twitter a few days ago. So there's a standard, and you saw it in the thumbnail for this video, a standard supply and demand graph showing an increase of minimum wage leads to unemployment. Of course, I countered that with the demand curve could just shift to the right and counteract that. And I didn't go into a lot of depth to why I was saying that, but for me, most of it is lags. And of course, there are other parts to it. I'm sure a lot of you have looked at, standard Econ 101 textbooks, and you've seen that graph. So an employment graph along with a monetary policy graph, a standard aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, and they're all lined up, right? And the line moves one way or the other in unison with each other. So that suggests that there's instantaneous knowledge between markets, which is highly fallacious. So things are adjusting instantly in one part of the economy. The next part of the economy knows. The central bank reacts instantaneously. And another thing with minimum wage policy, so one of the critiques against my post was, well, it's just going to be inflationary as soon as the policy happens. Well, actually, living in Canada, I know all about minimum wage policy. These are telegraphed well in advance policy, so increases in the minimum wage rate. So firms, as a former business owner, I was aware that there was going to be a policy change around minimum wage, and I would adjust my cost structure in my business. One thing I wouldn't do with a minimum wage increase, because I had semi-skilled workers and then skilled workers, and then any new people that would come in. I ran a trucking business. They would be helpers. They would actually come in at minimum wage at the time, and I think that was around $15 an hour at the time. That didn't prevent me. A small increase, if I had the business that was coming in, a small increase wouldn't stop me from chasing that business. The whole point of running a business is to make profits, right? And if you're not hiring employees to grow or scale your business, you're not increasing your profits, right? And you could argue that there are niche cases where, very small sole proprietors might not hire because of that immediate increase. And so there are fringe cases, or the other cases, businesses are so fragile that increase could actually, cause them to go under, in which case this, of course, is coming from capitalists that argue against minimum wage. You can say, well, then apparently that company wasn't strong enough to survive in capitalism, and it's washed away into the sea of destruction, you could say, and then the strong companies survive, like the big corporations, Walmart, et cetera. And then you look at that situation, you realize, those big corporations aren't there to protect the workers. They're there for a profit motive, right? To account to shareholders, right? So it's very important that we kind of look out for the least equitable citizens in our society that don't have that bargaining power. And we've seen the decline of unions in a lot of Western nations, over the last 40 years or so. A minimum wage policy, in my opinion, if managed well, indexed to other price levels, it can be quite beneficial to workers. I'll bring in let's see who I want to bring in for. Let's bring in Steve first this time. Steve Keen, here he is. Let's see if we can get. There we go. Holy crap!
The crowd is back. Okay.
The crowd is back. I got a new computer, so I can do a lot more again, or try to do things that are actually workable. Steve, before we get in the nuts and bolts, a simple yes or no response. Are you in favor for, basic minimum wage policy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
All right, let's bring on. I'll ask the same question to Mike. We'll just get a baseline of where we are on the panel. Here is Mike. He gets cheers too.
It sounds like a 1960s sitcom with the laugh track in the back, but okay.
Hey, we're working. We're slowly moving up this live stream.
It is in color, so that's good.
It is in color and brilliant color. And I think at this point we can safely say we are the longest continuous running live stream for economics on YouTube. I don't think we've seen other economic live streams more popular, but they come and go. We have gone, it's almost 4 years now. So
Bloody hell.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Michael, I'll ask you the same question. Are you in favor for minimum wage policy?
NES. N-E-S. That's a combination of no and yes.
Okay.
And I will elaborate on that
later.
You
will elaborate. That's interesting. That gives some context to all this. Let's check out the chat, everybody. If you got your questions, bring them into the chat. I will bookmark them, as we go through. Ideally, your ideas around minimum wage policy. Obviously, that's a blanket statement in itself. Maybe there's nuances to that policy, which I'm sure Mike will get into. And in fact, I think we'll start there with Mike. The NES answer you gave insinuates that there are some nuances to what you see a good minimum wage policy being.
Yeah. So I periodically think about this when I'm teaching econ classes and what have you. And I go back and forth in my mind about what would be, the best course of action. On the one hand, for example, I'm a golfer, not a good one, but I do love to play. My youngest son is really good. Humiliates his old man whenever we play. But our favorite driving range right near the house suddenly closed one day because the state of Massachusetts raised the minimum wage. They had a huge sign: "We are now closed. We can't afford to operate anymore." And they hired a lot of high school kids and stuff. It just was not affordable. And we were like, this is our place. We go like, no. Or you won't look at, a McDonald's or a Taco Bell or a Home Depot or a Walmart where there's very few checkout people. You do your own checkout. Now they replace people with machines. So these are all the sorts of things you'd hear from the neoclassical side. On the other hand, you see somebody at a restaurant or what have you working their what off. And you're like, wow, this person is really working hard and they should be paid well, decently for the effort they're putting forth, So I go back and forth. So if I may, what I'd like to do is talk about how we would handle this sort of thing in system dynamics, because that's kind of what we do around here. This is very common. You'll go into a consulting engagement, public or private sector. You're typically working with people who know a lot about whatever the thing is. You're not working with people, it's their second day on the job and they don't even know where the bathrooms are yet. They're high up in the organization. They have very good mental models. They've been doing it all the time. And they kind of know or have a good opinion as to, what's causing the problem or what have you. And of course, what happens? These folks don't agree. They're experts. And it's unusual for all the experts in the room to just say, oh, yes, of course, that's exactly, we all agree. Everybody has a different opinion as to what's important, what's not. Yeah, it's important, but not real important. Mine's more important, all this stuff. So what do? Well, we like to put everybody's stuff into the mix. And a good tool for that is causal loop diagramming. Let's get everybody's thoughts as to what is important to the problem at hand. And let's see how they all lay out in a system, right? And everybody is in, their stuff is in there. Your stuff is in there. My stuff is in there. Her stuff is in there. His stuff is in there. And it's all interacting. And then you begin to have a framework to try and see, well, what loops are important? When are they important? Are there leverage points? And what have you. And of course, then it cries out for formal dynamic modeling. From a causal loop diagram, you can't tell, but people feel good that their point of view has been represented in the discussion, as well as other points of view. And it's kind of like nobody's right, but nobody's wrong. Everybody's stuff is there. And then you can go forward. Now, am I allowed to show something real quick, a screenshot? I know you don't like screenshots, Ty, but if I can show just briefly what I'm talking about.
You can show your screen, Mike.
Okay. Now, if there is a God, it'll work.
Divine intervention.
Well, there's a lot of buttons to push here. Let's see.
God
here we
tells
go.
me the same thing. Yeah, okay.
Can you see that?
I'll bring it up.
Yep. Okay.
So I just real quickly, I have a whole thing of PowerPoints for my classes, but I just was pressed for time. So I just asked ChatGPT, give me the arguments for and against increasing the minimum wage. And it came up with the standard sort of, Kruger and Card and neoclassical and whatever arguments for and against. And I just made a causal loop diagram based on all this information for and against. And I didn't bother to put in all the formally identify each of the loops. I didn't really have time, but you have everybody's stuff in here, right? And then you can begin to say, all right, first of all, have we left anything out, or are we good here? Both sides of the aisle, whatever the argument is. And then we can begin to say, all right, if we were to build a model here, where would we begin and what have you? And let me give you one last example. I'm going to stop. I think I stopped sharing there. Did I?
Yeah.
So years ago, a guy by the name of Jack Homer, a very well-known, talented SD guy, senior guy in the field, was doing his doctoral dissertation. And he found that he would work so hard that actually his hands would cramp up and he couldn't sleep. And he was just overwhelmed by the work he was doing. So he would say, I got to take a break. And he would go home and he'd sleep in his bedroom he grew up in, and his mom would do his laundry and cook for him or whatever. And he'd relax, and his hands, his typing hands would relax, and he'd go back to school, begin working on his dissertation again. And pretty soon he's cramped up again, stressed, insomnia, whatever. He'd go home again and relax. And he's like, wait a minute, there's a pattern here. There's sort of an oscillatory pattern. And I'm an SD guy. Why is this happening? It was a worker burnout cycle. So he started looking into it, and he found there was a whole bunch of different disciplines that examined worker burnout, the military, management science, psychology, and what have you. And they had similar but different explanations for why it happened and what to do about it. So he said, well, I should build a model of this. So he did, and he integrated all the different competing explanations for worker burnout into a model, and then looked for leverage points and how do you mitigate it and whatever. So I think in some of these disputes, whether it's, this is kind of a big one, a national, dispute, or if it's in the boardroom somewhere and there's experts disagreeing about something, that this approach we find in system dynamics is productive. Not everybody always leaves happy, but at least you have a starting point where not everybody's got hatchets out,
I put a poll in the chat. Everybody, make sure you vote in it. It's just a simple question. Do you support a minimum wage policy? And of course, in your questions or statements, in this one, I'll take statements too, if you have any nuances, like Mike just had a lot of nuances to such a policy, put them in the chat and we'll bring them up and we'll talk about it. Steve, your nuances too. You were kind of unequivocal. You support a minimum wage policy, but I'm sure you have nuances to it, and I'd love to hear them.
Well, I mean, for a start, this is not a question of micro. And that's the problem. The way this is framed by neoclassicals is it's all microeconomics, just like that diagram you put up. Did you take that from a textbook, Ty, or did you draft it?
No, I just I took it from the internet, and it was based on the diagram I saw somebody post on.
It's standard.
But that's the standard
It's absolutely standard. So this is clearly an issue of the macroeconomics because the labor market is, it's the major source of income for most people in the country. So if you're going to try to analyze what's the impact of changing wages, minimum wage versus no letting a market wage rule, then you're in an area of macroeconomics. And there are two elements to that. And this is partly Mike's causal loop diagram there. For the individual capitalists, it can lead to, they can go broke, like you're talking about your golf manager. But for the collective of capitalists, this is a way of guaranteeing an income flow for workers. And it really comes down to not so much, whether minimum wage is a good idea or a bad idea, as to can you use that concept to solve unemployment? Because the argument that neoclassicals make is that a minimum wage actually causes unemployment. So if you look at that diagram of yours again, Ty, if you can bring it up, or I can show one on my computer.
Bring it up. Share your screen. I have so much power now and speed that I do not mind anymore.
Oh wow, what a change! Okay, I'm going to share this entire screen over here. This is from the Samuelson and Nordhaus textbook, which is the inheritor of Samuelson's neoclassical textbook that gave us the basics of so-called modern microeconomics. And its basic idea: you've got a supply curve, which is the number of people applying for a job, which rises as the wage rises, and then you have a downward sloping demand curve. So if you have the market's going to be down here, and if a minimum wage is imposed, then you get a higher supply and a lower demand. That causes unemployment. So that's the definition of unemployment for the neoclassicals, is a gap between the number of people on the market who want a job and the number of people who want to hire them. And the obvious solution in that case is, well, if there's unemployment, cut the wage, push it back down here towards equilibrium, and you'll both get an increase. You'll get an increase in employment coming out of that. And that was the advice that mainstream economists made before the Great Depression, or during the Great Depression. And what they basically said was, well, there's unemployment, 25% of the workforce, unemployment's rising. This is after the 1929 crash, of course, and unemployment is starting to rise. And the argument is, well, cut the wage. And if we cut wages, then we're going to go back to equilibrium again. And you can see this is a table taken from a National Bureau of Economic Research paper. And you find that there was a substantial cut in wages. Manufacturing wages fall from $27 an hour per week to $18, a huge fall for people working in the coal industry, et cetera, et cetera. Across the board, you had cuts in wages. And what happened? Unemployment rose. You went from 0 to 25%. So the fact that this remedy actually made things worse is one of the reasons we got the development of Keynes's approach to economics, which talks about the impact of things like wages on aggregate demand. And so if you have workers who a major, like 70% of the goods and services bought in the economy, roughly speaking, are bought by workers, if you cut the wage, they can buy less. And that therefore means that the companies, they're focusing upon their workers as a cost center, but their workers in general are a revenue source at the same time. And we live in we currently still live in an economy in which the mass market is a huge part of total demand. So again, roughly speaking, 70% of demand comes from workers, about 30% from capitalists and investment. And if you cut that income by cutting the wage and getting rid of a minimum wage, you actually reduce the aggregate demand effect of workers spending their wages, and you can bring the economy down even further. So it's not the sort of thing you can answer with a pair of bloody intersecting lines. And this is, unfortunately, this is the mindset that gets put into the head of economists by the training they cop at undergraduate degrees, that it says it's all just a case of, get rid of the minimum wage and unemployment will fall. And it is, to me, it's brain dead. This sort of thing should never be used for a market as critical as the labour market. And there are various ways you can drive a truck through this thing as well. So the supply of labour is supposed to be upward sloping, meaning that workers, if you cut the wage, they're going to want to work less. Now, the way that neoclassicals derive supply curves in general is to talk about a rising cost of production, rising marginal cost, or diminishing marginal productivity. You can't do that for the labour supply because, first of all, houses aren't factories. They're not sending out workers as production lines. They're families. And in that family, the way that the neoclassicals portray the decision to whether to work or not is to show an indifference curve between income and leisure. So on the vertical axis, you've got the amount of money you're making, and on the horizontal axis, you've got how many hours of leisure you have, and they then have a indifference curve showing your preferences between the number of hours of leisure versus amount of income you earn. And there's a slight problem about using indifference curves here, and that is the maximum amount of leisure you can do is 24 hours, and the maximum amount of labor you can do is 24 hours. So anything you don't do as to get leisure, you've got to work less. Now, that means that there's in terms of how they derive budget lines in their neoclassical thinking, the budget line for working out what commodities do is on the price axis, which is the vertical one. That's your point of rotation. For the workers and wages, the point of rotation is the 24-hour mark. If you do no work whatsoever, then you enjoy 24 hours of leisure, and then the slope of the line is the wage rate per hour. And when you play with that on a set of indifference curves, you can easily get a backward sloping supply curve. You can get a curve, in other words, where workers supply more labour at a low wage, where workers supply a small amount of labour at a low wage and a high amount of labour. A small amount of labour at a high wage and a large amount of labour at a low wage. The reason being that you need a certain amount of income to survive. There's no such thing as leisure if you've got no money. So the trade-offs that they do anyways, I'm going to be a bit long-winded here, but the point is this upward sloping supply curve, which is an automatic assumption of neoclassical economists for production of goods, cannot be guaranteed for workers. I could quite easily do my derivation from the indifference curves and the budget line for workers and derive a downward sloping supply curve. So the very mechanics of the model don't even support this abstraction, and yet this is what they continue teaching. You could have put this in a textbook in the 1920s, and it would have been taken just as seriously as it is today, despite the Great Depression, despite what we've learned since then. So it is a fallacious, even though I criticise the thanks, Matt. I criticise the supply curve nonsense when it's applied to normal commodities. It doesn't apply there either. But certainly in the case of labour, you cannot draw the curves the way that the textbooks do when working from textbook logic. So it's a fallacious model from the ground up. And the fact that this shit is still taken seriously is one of the reasons it points out just how primitive economics education is.
Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell. We've got quite a few questions here. I'll start off with kind of an MMT-related question here from Michael D'Souza Cruz. Without a job guarantee, transition job, employer of last resort program, isn't the minimum wage really zero? Steve or Mike, do you want to chime in on that?
I'll victimize you, Mike. Have a go at that one. Not really.
Well, Milton Friedman would always say that for African Americans, women who are paid less and whatever, the only weapon they have is the ability to offer a very low wage, given they don't have skills. They have a poor educational system and what have you. And then as they acquire skills, they can move up. So in some sense, I guess that would be the case. I suppose another, I was trying to look here quickly. It must have been an older set of slides. I used to have data on the percentage of people, at least in the US, that are not primary income earners earning the minimum wage. So it'd be like high school kids and part-time, this sort of thing. And again, if it's not the primary wage earner, if it's a high school kid, working part-time at McDonald's or something, and they're paid a minimum wage, is that really, they're getting started. It's sort of the unskilled level. And as they acquire skill, they are no longer paid the minimum wage. And then the other issue would be, I suppose, it's not directly answering the question, I guess, but if what we're really talking about is poverty levels and a living wage and all that, is the minimum wage really a leverage point using a system dynamics idea? Is that really the way to fix, if that's what we're really talking about here, not getting started, a teenager, no skills, but rather we're trying to have people earn a living wage. Do we really want to look elsewhere in terms of policy to make that happen? It's a kind of a low leverage policy.
Yeah. To me, it's static equilibrium thinking in a dynamic market, dynamic world, and that's the beginning of its problems. But there's so many elements about the relationship between the wage rate and economic development over time. And people often think that you cut the wage, you're going to give more profit to capitalists, they'll invest more, that'll lead to more growth. That's one of the thought process you can see people working on. But Mike, this is where your system dynamics drawing comes in. It's also possible that high wages actually force entrepreneurs to innovate. So if you've got a high wage level, then yes, it's encouragement to you to see, I wonder if I can develop a piece of machinery to replace those workers. And that actually appears to apply to the original periods of industrialization in the 1700s, because one of the first major inventions was the spinning jenny. And what that did was you went from having a single person working on a spinning wheel to spin, a wool into a fiber, and one person, one machine. And then the spinning jenny was invented, and when it first came out, one person spun 6 wheels. So you got 6 times effectively the output from one worker. And that was profitable in Scotland because the wages were quite high. And by replacing those 6 workers, you had a lower cost of production for the same product, so you could undercut your rivals, and off goes industrialization in Scotland. Now, why didn't that happen in France, for example, which was equally wealthy country at the time? It turned out the wages were too low. The spinning jenny would not have been profitable in France. The wages were so much lower that replacing 6 workers wasn't enough. You'd need to replace 8 or 10. The machinery didn't do it at the time. So industrialization began in the high wage country. And we've got a similar phenomenon just very recently, historical terms, in Singapore. I vividly remember, because I was working as an overseas aid officer at the time, hearing that Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew, had increased the minimum wage by 27%. Okay, and the idea was, he said, if you can't pay a wage this high in Singapore, we don't want you in Singapore. So it actually drove a lot of low-cost manufacturers out, and they moved back to Malaysia. This was part of the time when Singapore was breaking away from the Malaysia. I think it was part of Malaysia at the time, and it broke away. And everybody said, this is going to be gloom and doom for Singapore. Well, have you been to gloomy, doomy Singapore in recent years? It was part of the process of transforming it into a high-tech hub, and it's prospered. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world, let alone in Asia. So there are ways in which there are counterintuitive, and this again comes back to the system dynamics thinking, counterintuitive effects, whereas the neoclassical model is just a straightforward, reduce the one mechanism, drop the minimum, drop the wage, increase employment. And it's trivial thinking, and it's an insult that this is still being taught to students in textbooks.
Got another question here. I'm assuming, Alex, you're not much of a supporter of minimum wages. The minimum wage, government's poor attempt to wrestle with the unstoppable Cantillon forces of the wedge driving ever deeper. Don't don't know what he
Not
means.
quite as bad as the.
Hold on. Mike, actually, do you want to break down this question for me, because I don't understand it myself?
A wedge driving ever deeper. I'm a bit baffled. Like I've said before on this show, the only thing I remember from my graduate studies was Cantillon's quote about men multiply like rats in a barn. That's all I got on Cantillon. This is 46 years ago or something that I last read.
Alex, put some more detail to this question, and I'll get back to you. Evolution or revolution, what percent would you deem morally correct for a CEO to take compared to their lowest paid employees, Mike?
That's a good one. Yeah, I can. Let's start with my university. You know, we look at what the president is paid, and we always, when we're in faculty administrative war rooms, I've been on budget committees and whatever. You know, we always joke like, "Well, the president gets this amount," and I'll say, "Oh, Professor so and so will do it for half that amount." And they're like, "Rump. You don't understand. To get good people, we have to do this." I don't know what the exact number is. Certainly other countries have a much more reasonable split. You know, you don't want somebody first day on the job, no experience, right out of school to get paid what the CEO gets paid with 30 years of experience or what have you. But yeah, the split is ridiculous. 10-1 might be some number if you wanted me to pick a number, but not 200-1 or whatever the crazy numbers are. It's borders on just absurd.
Steve?
I'm just seeing one of the questions from Hamster up there, not used in serious mainstream.
No, hold on.
There is no such thing. I know. Stick with the question.
Okay. You're getting troll bait. I know Hamster. You're just getting baited.
He's definitely a troll. That's a troll comment.
Well, hold on. Trolls troll. Hamster's all right, but he is a troll. He is smart, but he's going to try to bait you. So stay on topic, Steve, to the question that's on the screen.
I don't know whether they still have it, but the Japanese used to have a rule of something like a 50-1 ratio between the lowest paid person
I was thinking of Japan,
and the highest paid person. And the idea there is that if your CEO wants to increase his pay, then he's got to raise the overall revenue for the firm, and the income of the poorest worker comes along with it. So people behave in a cooperative fashion. And this is, it's certainly part of our behavior in a collective group. If you think that the boss is being paid ridiculous wage and doing shit work, then you're likely to be fairly lackadaisical in how you go about your job. And I've had personal experience of that with a company called Trash for Treasure. The CEO used to turn up every weekend in a Rolls Royce with a different dolly bird on his arm. And we got paid, not just paid a trivial wage, but equally we were docked for every ticket that didn't get. There was something about the number of tickets coming through and the number of people. And we get docked for each one we missed. And so one or two docks would be losing money. So we all just basically ended up robbing the damn thing. We'd pocket enough money out of the tickets to cover the potential fines we'd got from the bloody boss. So, we hated the bastard. And this was accentuated by the huge gap between what we were being paid and what he was raking off from the top. So it's partly what the Japanese are trying to do is create a collective mentality. And the same the same thing applies to the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain, which was formed by a Catholic priest in a depressed area trying to get the industry to come in. And he wanted to have, he put all sorts of Catholic social principles inside there that you didn't want to have a hierarchy developing. You wanted to get everybody benefiting because it was cooperatively owned. So they again have rules about the gap between minimum wages and the wage of the CEOs, and they rotate the CEOs as well. So it's partially getting something which, by guaranteeing the poorest person still does well enough to have a decent life given their constraints, that gives you a group of people working in the firm who behave with the firm's interest at heart rather than, deciding to rip the firm off, which is what our Trash and Treasure Rolls-Royce driving CEO inspired us all to do.
All right. So
so when
let's no, well, we got so many questions, Mike. I gotta keep it going here. So Hamster though, I'll indulge Steve and I'll indulge Hamster. Which you can find Hamster's real photo on the internet if you look hard enough. But that's another story. Does Steve Keynes know that static equilibrium model is not used in serious mainstream policy analysis? Steve, I know you're triggered by this, so go at it. Here's your chance. Go at it.
For a start, everything's fucking equilibrium. Pardon, there I go for French again. Everything's equilibrium in neoclassical thinking. It's dynamics. If you want general, you make it dynamic, not having equilibrium inside there. So they still use equilibrium, and if they call it dynamic, it's a farce. It's not genuine dynamics to begin with. Secondly, one comment I remember from a colleague of mine who worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet back in Australia in the days of Paul Keating, who was the last interesting Australian Prime Minister. He wasn't a good one, but he was interesting. He said that what happened inside the cabinet room was that there'd be some event would occur which would cause total, what the hell do we do? How do we handle this sort of reactions? Little things like, cutting off the Strait of Hormuz. What does Australia do about that? So there's all these fights about what to do, and there'd be no particular direction at all until somebody said something that everybody had read in a first-year economics textbook. And then, let's do that, because they all had the same mental mindset. So this sort of stuff, even though it's allegedly not used to make serious policy, it's the background that is thinking that all people who get themselves into a position of power share, and that will become the default way of thinking when a crisis first strikes. What does the supply and demand curve tell me to do? So even though they don't actually include it in what they call serious mainstream policy analysis, it's still in the way that most people in the mainstream think, and it's the way that people with advice from economists will be interpreted. So it's still dangerous, and it shouldn't be taught. It should come with brain damage warnings.
And that's all. Sorry. That's all. That's Mike. That's all the time that Hamster gets on the show. But I actually
have a short wheel, does he?
I have a wheel. Yes, a short wheel. He's actually a lovely human being, and in fact, he sent a thread to you about a week ago, and you were a little bit triggered by it, but you seemed to understand he was rage baiting you. His same name on Twitter, but he's actually he's open to Austrian economics, post-Keynesian economics, neoclassical. He's one of those people that just actually loves economics. And he would love to rage bait you too, Steve. So you just got to be careful. Mike, this one's for you. I was actually, oh no, this one is not for you. Okay. Is actually having a job in the diagram. So he's referring to the diagram you showed, Mike. Is that in that causal loop diagram?
Yeah, there's employment in there. Yeah, I didn't go through the details of it in the interest of time.
Can you actually bring up that diagram again and go through the details of the diagram? Because that shit's interesting. Let's do that.
Role system dynamics class here. Yeah.
Pressure's on, Mike. Hurry up.
Yeah, I just have to find it. Sorry about that. There's a lot of buttons.
Jack in replace with the minimum wage worker. Needs to be motivated, obviously.
How about that?
There we go. Here it comes.
Right. So there's a variety of arguments on both sides of the aisle. Most of these are the standard, stuff that goes back and forth. So in the center of the diagram, we have the minimum wage. And by the way, I was going to make the point earlier. It sort of lends itself to this. I was going to refer back to this anyway about, why don't we have sort of national healthcare or national healthcare insurance in the U.S.? We have private company sponsored, by and large, health insurance. And it's because of this link right here. Back after World War II, I think it was Kaiser Permanente in California noticed that, hey, worker productivity is higher when we have healthier workers. They don't miss work. When they're at work, they're more lively and what have you. So let's make sure we keep our workers healthy. So that's kind of the same idea here. Minimum wage goes up, worker health goes up after a delay. The two lines mean a delay, and their productivity goes up. More productivity, ceteris. Each of these links is drawn, as economists would say, ceteris paribus, or if you want to do math talk, like a partial derivative, meaning anything else that influences one of these variables is out of the picture, remains constant. We're only looking at the relationship between two things here. So worker productivity goes up, everything else remaining the same. Business revenue will go up. And now maybe I should have put in here the firm's ability to pay the minimum wage, but the minimum wage therefore goes up. So that's a positive reinforcing feedback loop. That's a good thing. Same thing with worker morale. You're going to pay me more. I might actually care, might show up on time. I won't be high or whatever, and productivity goes up. Same thing, another positive loop. Minimum wage goes up, turnover goes down. I like my job. I don't come to work hating it. I'm paid fairly for what I do. Worker productivity is going to go up. Turnover goes down.
You've got a wrong sign there, by the way, mate. You've got a minus there. You want to have a plus.
Where?
Workers turnover to worker productivity. You've got a minus. See it?
When turnover goes down, productivity goes up because you're keeping the same.
Oh, okay. So turnover is a positive. Okay. Yeah. Pardon me. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. But again, positive loop. So these are all good things that reinforce the idea of a higher minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the question was about employment. Yeah, we got employment level over here. So what do we have here? So minimum wage goes up. The cost of doing business goes up. So the demand for low skilled labor goes down. Okay. And employment then same direction is going to be lower than it otherwise would be. And low wage worker income is going to be lower. And this just squirts off here to the poverty level. And similarly, you got the same idea. We're going to start substituting machines for people, and same effect there. And that goes over to here to what? Aggregate demand. So this is exogenous. It squirts off, but goes to aggregate demand. This is Steve's macro sort of Keynesian point here. When that goes down, aggregate demand goes down, local economic activity goes down, business revenues go down, and the ability to pay the minimum wage goes down. So that's two negative loops counteracting the growth or the positivity of the positive loops. Similarly, business costs minimum wage goes up, business costs go up, they raise prices. Real purchasing power goes down. Obviously, this is at the macro level. So real wages go down, aggregate demand goes down, local economic activity goes down. And again, we got a negative loop going there. And I think that's pretty much all of them in there. So that kind of incorporates these. There's kind of about a half dozen of these concepts on either side of the argument, and they're all kind of in here in one place. So we again, we're trying to say, all right, well, let's get everybody's stuff in there, and you can't resolve it by just looking at that causal loop diagram. We're saying that there's self-reinforcing and counteracting or balancing forces in here. So which way is the system going to go? You can't say until you start modeling with equations and stocks and flows and all that. And similarly, you'll get into situations where in the short run, it looks the one way, but then the system adapts. When you have those delay marks in there over time, there's delays in the system. It'll adapt and go the other way, maybe even will be worse. And you can get into tipping points or shifting feedback loop dominance where things are going along swimmingly and suddenly you fall off a cliff. Can't tell that from a causal loop diagram. But what we found is in these sort of group model building situations, when you do this sort of technique and you get everybody's stuff on the table and say, look, anybody object to anything that's in here, or a better way to say it is, your stuff is in there, right, Sally? And your stuff is in there, right, Johnny? We're not leaving anything important out, right? And everybody's cool. Then you start to say, all right, let's start building a model here. And again, you find out most people agree on most things, right? It's just the 10% of the stuff where they disagree. And then you have a very focused conversation about what to do, right?
Make sure you
the short answer is employment's in the
yeah.
Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, vote on the poll I've got going on in the chat itself. I'd like to get a rundown. I had a really fancy overlay for the. Here we go. Now we're looking a little fan. I'm doing lots of new stuff on the stream because I have the capability to do it live.
This is, as a Notre Dame St. Norbert and St. Cornelius graduate. Today is Good Friday, and purple is for Lent. So just
well, and I thought
he has his own religion, but
now I didn't design this overlay, but because I have some purple in my relearning economics logo, I thought, well, this is a perfect overlay to let everybody know, hey, chat. We take chats. It's a live stream chat. So get your questions in. I specifically, if you have some nuances about the minimum wage, I would like to hear about it, because that stuff's pretty interesting to me. I'm going to rearrange some stuff here, and I'm going to get to the next one. This one, it's a kind of a homage to Steve. So just finished reading Steve's responses to Mark Lavoie on Y equals D plus credit. Did Mark agree finally, Steve, regarding the minimum wage? Where does growing MW push the Goodwin cycle?
Well, let's go for the first one. I've been, when I first started arguing about the financial crisis approaching, one little shorthand I was using was to say that aggregate demand is equal to GDP plus the change in debt. Now, I was challenged on that in a debate with Mark Lavoie, but also Brett Feibiger. And yet, as usual, another bloody Canadian. They're all Canadians that I benefit from in this thing. And what Brett pointed out in that debate was to say that, well, aggregate demand is aggregate income. So they're can't be true. And what Brett said is, unless Keynes can show that his role for credit in the economy is consistent with aggregate demand being identical to aggregate income, he had better rethink his arguments. And my reaction to that was, well, that's quite true. Unless I can prove that that's consistent, then I've made a mistake. And I don't believe I've made a mistake. So let's see if I can actually incorporate the two. Now, when I did it the first time I worked it out, it was rather more complicated than I've reduced it to since then. And this tends to be the way that ideas start. You start with a complicated version and then you can fine tune it down. But the basic point was it showed that if you lived in a world in which banks were just intermediaries, then it would be true that credit doesn't add to aggregate demand, because if you borrow money off another person or another sector, so if the household sector borrows money off the services sector, then there's a transfer of spending power from the services sector to the households, and the aggregate effect credit cancels out. But when you include that banks create money, what you find in the logic there is that the bank is creating the additional spending power by credit dollars per year being added to people's bank accounts, and nobody borrows money for the sheer pleasure of being in debt. So that credit is borrowed to be spent. And so, let's say it's the household sector borrowing off the banking sector and then spending that money on manufacturing goods, then there's credit dollars per year added to the money that the household sector has in its account. It transfers that money to the manufacturing sector, and the demand in the economy goes up by credit. So credit dollars per year is added to aggregate demand in one sense, but what it actually ends up being is that aggregate demand is the turnover of existing money plus the creation of new money. And that's the way they're integrated. Now, I haven't spoken to Mark for ages. We're good mates. I think I actually did present this to Mark's students in France. Last time I saw Mark was, oh God, it must be 8 years ago now, quite a while. He was working in France, teaching there, and then he invited me down to give a seminar, and I covered this point in his seminar. So I can say basically, yes, Mark does agree with me on this front. But the trouble is, it's very hard to show this using discrete time modeling, whereas it's extremely easy to show it using continuous time modeling. And on that front, I don't think I've yet converted Mark to thinking in continuous time. So it's hard to see these effects with discrete time models, because everything happens between the periods in a discrete time model. You can't show credit rising in a time period because everything's constant across the time period. So I think he's accepted, but it certainly hasn't turned up as part of the neoclassic, the post-Keynesian lexicon yet. But it should, because it shows that endogenous money leads to credit having a critical role in economic activity, and that's what explains the booms and busts of capitalism.
A question here from Frank, a little off topic, but we'll hit it up. If all financial assets net to zero and the system demands profit from all participants, then wouldn't losers be baked in? Wouldn't they be workers by default? Mike, take a shot.
Can I do something first real quick here? I just pulled this up. I got to do this because I think Steve will enjoy it. Is that what you mean, Steve?
They're waiting for it to turn up first of all, mate. Let's see. All right. Got it there. So let's see. Hang on. Right. In fact, no, it's a later time than that, mate.
That was like 2015. No?
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. No,
we were in Grenoble for the conference.
No, it was actually in Paris, and like one other reason to remember it, Mark and I both play tennis, and Mark beat me in every tennis match we ever played until that one, because long story, I damaged my backhand by chasing a female squash player and ruined my backhand. Got sick of it decades after I did the damage, and then decided, bugger this, I'm going to buy myself a ball machine and get my backhand back to some reasonable standard. And then I took Mark apart in our final tennis match.
Well, he was a two-time Olympian on the Canadian Olympic fencing team.
He's brilliant. He's a natural sportsman. Yeah, but I think I took him down 6-2 in that match.
I just want to point out in that picture, Steve had reached that critical age where you just look like you're going to look like until you die. And Mike, you had you had not reached that age, but you have reached it now. Yeah. There's definitely, you've definitely, now now if you were a woman, Mike, I obviously wouldn't say that, but you're a brotherly
Does
man.
my ass look bigger than this?
Guys don't care.
Yeah, you're definitely growing into some wisdom physically, you could say. But I'm going to bring up the question again from Frank. And so again, if all financial assets net to zero and the system demands profits from all participants, and then wouldn't there be losers baked in? Wouldn't they be workers by default? Mike, give your best chance. Now, I see confusion on your face.
Yeah,
that's okay.
It's more my sort of thing. That's why Mike's.
Let's Steve. Yeah, I'm
okay.
Like that.
Yeah,
just deferred to Steve. Here we go.
Okay, this is basically the logic that I use in godly tables to say that when you look at people's assets and their liabilities, financial assets are claims on other people, financial liabilities are other people's claims on you. The sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. Okay. Now that's just accounting for the cash flows. It doesn't mean that people can't make a profit or people can't earn a wage. And this I think shows the primitive nature of development of dynamics in economics, even amongst people who are aware that it should be dynamic. We tend to get caught up in a little accounting comment like this will make people think, well, you can't make a profit or you can't pay wages because everything sums to zero. It's about the accounting of cash flows. It's not the amount of work that the cash flows can then support, because in that godly table logic of looking at workers being paid a wage, so there's money coming out of the firm's account which is minus wages, and that goes into the workers' accounts which is plus wages. The row sums to zero, but wages are still being paid. Equally, if you've got firms producing output and then having costs to produce the output, if the output exceeds the cost of the inputs, then you get a profit. And it's quite possible to have, and I've done a little simple Minsky/Revel models of this, that you can have a fixed money supply turning over indefinitely, where the workers earn a positive wage and the capitalists make a positive profit and the banks get a positive interest rate return. There's no contradiction between the sum of all assets and liabilities being zero and positive incomes being generated out of the turnover of even a fixed amount of money, let alone a rising amount of money. So it's we need to get the level of economics dragged up quite dramatically from where it stands at the moment, because this awareness of thinking dynamically in a monetary system is still quite limited, even amongst progressive economists.
So let me
Gotta-
jump in real quick here on this. When I was an undergraduate,
hold on. You gave up your rights there. It's kind of like if you were a
Oh, come on, let's
citizen.
have an argument here.
I didn't even know I had any rights to give up.
You're an American. You're a free, libertarian type citizen. You have rights, but you
they're
did.
just going to do the
Endowed
Democratic
by
thing, and
creator.
they're going to vote in your favor, Mike. So go right ahead. You've got a majority here.
Go ahead, Mike.
So when I was an undergraduate, my dad, who was an accountant, said, when I went to college, you're going to take some accounting. It'll serve you well. So
Yeah.
I did, and it did serve me well. At one point, I wasn't going to be an economist. I was going to be a banker. And I proudly said at several job interviews, I have a master's degree in economics. And they said, great, how much accounting have you had? my accounting classes counted more than my master's in economics. And I think you can, in modern times, go through a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in economics and still have no idea about double entry accounting,
Exactly.
about how to read a financial statement. And yet we study and teach the theory of the firm. The absurdity of that is beyond comprehension. That's why at our economics program here at WPI, I insisted that the students have to take accounting, even though they're going to be econ majors. So, and Steve is absolutely right. In the sense of double entry accounting, now I understand the context of that question. He's absolutely right.
That's what it was, yeah.
We're
using Ravel for that teaching, mate.
Yeah.
That's one thing Ravel's got over any other system dynamics program is
no argument there. Yeah, it's a wonderful contribution. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Thomas,
in fact, one last thing. The suggestions are now being made to the Stella people to add godly tables.
Well, I'm happy about that. I want to see more than one program have it, so that's right.
Actually, I actually have been avoiding that. So I've got version 3 on my Dynamo replication, website. And one of the things I thought about was a godly table. I'm like, that's so disrespectful to Steve to add that.
Go for it.
I have avoided doing that, and I've stolen ideas now. So one of the upgrades in version 3 is I love Stella's little, so you have your stock flow diagram, and you can kind of sim run it, and the wires and pipes that connect the nodes or variables pulse. So you can see the dominant feedback loops. And I'm like, you know what? Stealing that, because that's really cool.
Oh, look, that's one thing I wanted that for Ravel. I just haven't had enough money to support my programmer to get it done. I wanted to have different colored wires for different sorts of flows. So one color for goods, another for money. I wanted to have the thickness relating to the flow. We had this old thing called a Phillips diagram, which we've done there used to be in the program QED, which is the first program I designed with a rather weird, eccentric English programmer doing it, that had stocks and flows done in the usual, buckets holding water and the flows passing through them and pipes spinning. So you could see a valve spinning to see how fast something was turning. So I want to have all those features added to the program for sure.
Yeah, I figured out how to do godly tables in Stella just in the native program. Yeah. But it wasn't me who suggested. Other people have suggested to the Stella people that they put that in.
Let them know.
Because I didn't want to steal it, but
let them know.
Other people have seen it.
Absolutely.
Now, whether they'll do it or not, they get a gazillion suggestions for improvements.
Yeah. But that's look. You know how the major that it helps you handle not just money, but also anything where there's conservation going on. So any conservation law, if you're moving, matter from one point to another.
Yeah. So one of the big principles in system dynamics is making sure your models are robust and they don't do anything silly. Everything's accounted for and what have you. So it's just another way of doing that, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, there's actually an interesting phenomenon that happens, Mike, with using godly tables. And in order to enforce double entry bookkeeping, you have to create stocks that don't necessarily have influence in the model. So they become supplementary stocks. So they're scorekeeping, but they're not doing anything. And I know best practices in system dynamic models, if your levels, stocks, integrators aren't doing anything, why do you have them in the model? But on the flip side of that actually drives the modeler to explore, okay, what does aggregate equity for, let's say, the firm sector do in the model?
Mm.
What behavior comes out of that? What feedback loop should you be adding? So it's an interesting it's only modelers would know that, system dynamic modelers would see that, but it's an interesting phenomenon that comes up because it forces you to address some levels that would otherwise just be scorekeeping levels that don't do anything else.
Yeah, but I think that's a little bit of old thinking. If you look at Richardson and Pugh's book that we've discussed, Introduction to System Dynamics Model with Dynamo, they have a scorekeeping pure aggregator, a stock that's not part of a feedback loop as for their project management model. And that was done in 1980. And then Jack Pugh wrote Dynamo. So I think, and Jay's principles of systems, he has a principle, never put DT in a flow equation. And we do that all the time now. And Jay knew that and it didn't object. So I think the thinking as to what the best practice is has evolved over time. Some of it has not. You need a stock inside of a feedback loop. Otherwise, you have simultaneous equations and what have you. But other things have changed over time as we've learned more. So
yeah, and you know what? It depends on the domain. So, for instance, modeling MMT, it's actually a great domain because MMT mentions, this is just a scorekeeper, right? And in fact, it can kind of highlight that's all that it's doing in the model. It's just the debt to GDP ratio or some government debt. It actually does nothing in an MMT model if it were a system dynamic model. But it's how we interpret how the economy is doing. But then if you kind of look at the model, then you see it actually has no influence. Thomas, the question, sorry, it's been about 10 minutes. I keep trying to get to it. Thomas asked me, because I'm a Canadian, he's a Canadian too, if the taxes you pay to your province were instead paid to the provincial government as spending per capita into circulation by Canada's Parliament, so the federal government, would your quality of life improve? My answer is no. So, like the United States, there is a division of power between the federal government in Canada and the provinces. So, for instance, we have federal health care, but the provinces individually administer it depending on their demographics. So there is an argument, and libertarians would love me kind of venturing into this area. Smaller government helps local communities better. That's why we have municipalities. So as much as we want to, get into who's the currency issuer and who's the currency users, the application of programs I have found have been better, at least in Canada, have been better administrated by the provinces themselves because it's very focused on the demographics. And as you know, Thomas, the demographics across Canada vary quite wildly. But that's not to say that there isn't an administration role from the federal government. For instance, healthcare, some of our provincial taxes goes into healthcare, our healthcare program here in Canada, and a portion comes from the federal government, which is primarily through deficit spending. And there's nothing wrong with that because, as you know, it's the federal government is the currency issuer. But when it comes to taking provincially issued taxes, remitting them to the federal government for the federal government then to distribute back to me, depending on my needs, I think is a little bit administratively intensive, to say the least. Whereas I would count, and this, of course, this isn't a rock solid truth. I would count that my provincial government knows a little more about me as an individual versus the federal government, just like maybe my municipal government knows a little more about my property's value to issue property tax than the provincial government. So that's kind of where my opinion stands on that. But summing all that up, this is something that happens down in the United States. You have, your federal government, your states, and then your counties. Up here we have districts, and then your municipalities. Mike, his question from an American perspective, I know I talked about healthcare, but you have programs down there that are federal and state and municipality. What's your thoughts on state taxes being remitted to the federal government for the federal government to run programs?
Yeah, I don't know that our quality of life would be better. It might be worse. You know, as you correctly said, the local people know a little bit more about what's going on. The federal government, this is, public sector econ 101, the Musgrave and Musgrave stuff, where the national government has superior revenue raising power typically, and then it can distribute block grants and what have you to the states, and for that matter to the cities, where they know better where the potholes are and what have you. But going the other way, I'm not sure somebody in Washington knows what's going on in Sterling, Massachusetts, or cares very much. By the way, do I have to type a question into the question thing, or can I ask a question?
I would prefer you to do it just like this question here suggests that we move funds to the federal government just to bring them back provincially. I want you to type a question so I can see the question, so I can put it on the screen to ask the question, so you can repeat the question. No, Mike, ask the question.
Okay, just wanted to stay within the rules. Explain to me why the CEO of Air Canada had to resign because he didn't say whatever he said in both French and English line by line or at all, or I didn't quite grasp what the issue there was.
Yeah, so I'd have to look at it. Air Canada is highly federally regulated. So in Canada, all government positions, if you want a government job, you have to be bilingual. So you have to know French and English because it's a bilingual. It's more intense than Spanish and English down in the States. It is a very core it's came out of Canada appeasing to Quebec to make sure there was no separation issues, right? So it's evolved over time where they're both primary languages. Now, English is obviously the more dominant spoken language here, but French is by law on equal footing with English. As for Air Canada, I don't have an actual answer for it because I'm not too sure if it's a pseudo crown corporation, or if it's just so heavily regulated that language laws around it have to be appeased. I heard it in passing about 2 days ago, and to be honest, Mike, I've become quite jaded to the Quebec issue in Canada. It's just an ongoing issue where there are separatists in Quebec that keep pushing these issues to the forefront, which that narrative gets amplified in the media. And of course, I know the US now is very hyper sensitive to finding Canada's faults right now and amplifying them themselves. But for me, it's a big nothing burger. So I don't have a big opinion on it, other than if they are a private company, it would be highly disturbing. I would have to look. This is something I'll get back to you next week. If they are just simply a pure private company, and it just comes down to peer pressure that he didn't speak in French, that's highly disturbing because regardless of the government positions, Canada itself, I'm free to only speak English if I choose. There's no I'm not forced to go say "Comment ça va? How are you doing today?" Right? I'm not.
Can I give you a joke on that front, mate?
Go ahead.
I had a French girlfriend in my late 20s, early 30s, I think it was.
Ooh.
Living in
oui.
Je ne sais quoi. But anyway, I normally speak English all the time because she had a good command of English. I had virtually no command of French. But one time I rang up, I thought I might as well try the bonjour, comment ça va? You know what she said back? Who is this? So I went back to English instantly. How bilingual are you, Ty? Can you actually hold a conversation?
Not very good. Marie is very good. Now,
Okay.
Marie is very good, but I just never. So my grandmother, who I grew up with, was this day and age would be considered racist. She was firmly of the English background,
Okay.
and in our household, she said some very derogatory things about the French Canadians. Now, I don't hold those views. I think Canada's stronger with that, diversity.
Yeah.
I think it just makes us a bit. It's like you can either breed with your own family members or breed properly with other,
Yeah,
a terrible
outlaw.
analogy, right? But that's what
Well,
makes Canada really good. So no, I can't speak it very well, but Marie, wow, she can speak it like fluently. I'm very proud of her, but not me. I know how to count in French. I know how to say hello in French, right? I can understand some basic French if it's spoken to me.
yeah,
And there's a huge difference between Quebec French and
yeah,
French
French.
from France. So there's a big difference. Now, Mike, down in New Orleans, there is quite a big French population
True.
that
It was
is
the French Quarter. Yeah.
yeah, so that you guys have a bit of a French revolution in the making. Maybe New Orleans might be separating one day from the United
More likely
States.
next door, Texas would be going before Louisiana, but
We're going Spanish again, or what?
let's
be their own country.
let's get back to some questions here because we still have a lot. This one's from Zoe, who's a Patreon subscriber to my Patreon, and I believe Steve's as well.
Sounds like.
Let's
Sorry,
let's
Lindsay. Yeah, she is good friend.
So
Yeah.
let's in the world of perfect competition and no excessive profits, would increasing minimum wage create price inflation? If so, what are the flaws in this argument? We've covered it, but we have viewers rotating in and out. So Steve, I'll start with you, and then Mike, you can accent whatever, Steve.
Well, perfect competition is a myth to begin with, unfortunately. The whole idea of perfect competition is firms maximizing profit by equating price to marginal cost. And there's only one problem. Firms don't have rising marginal costs, so it's a mythical model to begin with. But in that, that's one reason I won't actually answer the question, because it's a mythical model. If that world existed, if the neoclassical world existed, then to some extent, neoclassical things would happen in it. So this is giving us a neoclassical position and saying, if you increase the minimum wage, what will happen? And in that model, you're going to get, they leave out the feedbacks that are a critical part of how Mike and I and Ty understand the world. So they have no feedbacks from reducing wages to reducing revenue for the firms that sell to workers, and thereby reducing profit and undermining aggregate demand. That sort of stuff just doesn't turn up in the neoclassical model. But the important thing is that the way people think about these issues is framed by neoclassical concepts like perfect competition, and they're completely fallacious. The foundations of empirically are completely false. It's just if it's the classic case of having an argument over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And unfortunately, that's what economic theory in general has been
11,
like.
Steve, 11 angels.
11. Okay, I thought it was 13.5, mate. I thought it was pi angels.
I like pi better. That's a good number.
Pi angels, yeah, pi angels can dance on the head of a pin. But yeah, it's what's always identifying is this is the sort of thinking that runs in the background of economists' minds, because they might claim they've become more sophisticated with DSGE models, which I have no time for, as you know. I don't think any of us do. But they're still basically working from the same idea: perfect competition, equilibrium, profit maximization by equating marginal cost and marginal revenue, consumption, utility maximization given budget constraints, etc., etc. If that were the real world, then some of, but not all, of the neoclassical conclusions would flow. And some of them don't flow because some elements of neoclassical thought actually contradict neoclassical thought. So you rational expectations, for example, assumes free information. Oh, that's cool. So there are fallacies in the model, even so. But because that's our starting point, this is one reason we have these conversations, because that's the mindset people are coming out of. In the neoclassical world, a minimum wage would cause unemployment. And that's what the model shows. But it's a fallacious model, not just of the macroeconomy, but the microeconomy as well.
Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, it just seems like a blending of micro and macro in one question. Inflation being a macro idea, and the pure competition thing being. I mean, I guess the idea is it would be a macro because everything in the world would be a, sort of a Walrasian autonomous process, a perfect competition world. But yeah, it's just it's more of Steve angels dancing on the head of a pin. I mean, I guess we could think our way through it, but why? It's really sort of
Yeah. I'd
waste
rather
of
kill
time.
them. Oh, they're going to use the pin to kill the angels. Oh, there was one question there on
Killing angels.
yeah. Pin the angels down or maybe up. Never know which way you pin
Like
an
a
angel.
butterfly on its wings.
That's right. But
Oh,
there's somebody asked a question about solvers earlier
Okay,
there.
so that's my next one, and I'll chime in on it first because I actually know the issue. So
Yeah.
Russ uses a generic RK4 adaptive solver, and for most situations, it's pretty robust. So I don't see how the user's struggling, and it's more likely that he has a missized time constant and might want to adjust the absolute error and relative error or the DT time step, and it would probably solve his problem. However, in the Python package, they have RK 4.5, and it is a strong algorithm, and you can get around solving issues that you'll have with the generic RK4 adaptive solver that Ravel uses, where you don't have to play around with some of those time constants and your absolute and relative error and your DT time step. It's something maybe the next time I talk to Russell, because it wouldn't be a hard thing for him to code the algorithm into Ravel to be
There's a
solved.
whole lot of routines that are used to solve systems of differential equations. So we use the Runge-Kutta algorithm, which is probably the oldest. But you also have I think it's called the Bursler algorithm. There's the Levenberg-Marquardt algorithm. I didn't know of LSODE. As soon as I saw it, okay, ODE, ordinary differential equations. So I went searching for it on the web, and I haven't seen it before. It's going to be the same sort of thing. You've got an approximation process which generates errors, and then you have another routine that tries to minimize the errors in each step forward. So the Runge-Kutta algorithm from memory uses the what's it called? Oh damn! I've already forgotten the bloody name. Graham-Schmidt renormalization is done at each step to say the errors don't compound. Whereas if you do like an Euler solver, which is the simplest possible way to solve simulate a system of differential equations, the errors are quite large and they get amplified by each step forward. So you can only handle very simple issues with a Euler solver, whereas you can handle quite sophisticated elements with RK4, and I think there's RK5 as well these days.
Python supports all of those, so that's why he's not running into trouble.
It's just a question of time. I mean, I wish Russ, that's why I want to hire, just a multiple, at least another half dozen programmers, so I can dedicate things like let's improve the solution algorithm.
That actually highlights a problem about proper modeling. Again, most of those issues, because I've done this and Mike would know this himself too, right? For so long that's actually a modeling issue. And RK4 adaptive solver is for system dynamic modeling is more than enough in almost any situation. So if the user, the pot is still watching, think about you can just AI this, right? About time constant sizes versus your DT size and relative and absolute error sizes. You could probably solve this situation that way. And system dynamicists have been doing fine with RK4 solvers for decades now, and even an Euler's solver is applicable if you are modeling correctly. And in fact, some very sophisticated models are Euler's based, right? Whereas, for instance, it's very difficult to run the Goodwin model on a first order solver. You need to run it in the fourth order. But if you add enough zeros to your DT and run your model very, very slowly, it will run fairly accurate over time. But you're doing 0.000001.
And this is one thing which, again, let's make a bit of a point about dynamic modeling here, because we're all devotees of continuous time modeling. And when you deal with most post-Keynesians who do discrete time modeling, they don't really understand why it's wrong. I've had this conversation with Mark on a number of occasions, and it's just, they basically say, well, the data is discrete, so should our modeling technique be? And if you read the original Forrester 56 paper, he points out that if you have a set of discrete data points, you want to have your model have smooth lines for those data points, not triangles effectively from one point to another. And therefore, even if your data is discrete, then you should have at least 5 times the frequency of sampling in your simulation system. So even if your data is discrete, you should be using continuous time. Now, once you do that continuous time, people say, oh, how do you work out the time steps? The answer is you don't. The mathematicians have already worked out routines that handle it for you. So you don't even have to think in terms of the time step when you build a model in Ravel, because it's using the Runge-Kutta algorithm. You simply state the dynamics and it'll do the simulation for you. So this is one of the areas where non-orthodox economists, because they get taught by conventional economists and they then break away, if they don't go and learn mathematics independently from a genuine mathematics department, they end up stuck in the same mistakes the neoclassicals are making, which is using discrete time for a continuous time system.
Mike, fill in the steps there. This is actually a good domain for you as a system dynamicist, when it comes to solvers, and, issues with them, impart some of your knowledge.
Yeah. So I put in the internal chat a paper I wrote with one of my doctoral students that addresses a lot of these issues. The YouTube version requires me to chop it way down, so I haven't done that yet. So there's a lot going on here with the discrete versus continuous time thing, right?
Yeah.
A lot. We could spend 2 hours just on this topic. I believe it's the most confusing thing in system dynamics, learning system dynamics, particularly when you're dealing with economists who think, as Steve said, with discrete time, because the economic calendar releases data, in discrete chunks. So a digital computer cannot take infinitesimally small steps forward in time. It has to take discrete steps forward in simulated time. It can take very teeny steps, but it cannot take infinitesimally small steps. If you try to make it step tinier and tinier, you run into round-off error. That's a problem. That's a floor. And if you try and make a step too big, you get integration error and you're very inaccurate. In some sense, that's the ceiling. You're bounded by integration error and round-off error on a digital computer. So you have to select your time step, your DT, your how far the machine is going to step forward in time carefully. And as Ty kind of alluded to, it depends on the integration method you're using. It depends on the time constants in the model that you're using, the biggest time constants and what have you. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into deciding, what your a step size should be, and hence the amount of accuracy you need in your simulations. Very different if you're looking at dollars and cents, as an economist usually does, 2 places to the right of the decimal point, or you're trying to send a space probe to Pluto, where the errors are compounding over light years or whatever it is,
not quite light years, mate, but
but a lot of years, right?
Years, a lot of years, not light years.
Yeah. Okay. So the point is, I'm not a physicist, so I'm spitballing there, but the point is, it depends on the problem, right?
Yeah.
So so there's all that. We have tricks in system dynamics to get us out of certain jams, stiff models where you have fast and slow rates of change that you need to be in the same model. What do I do? What do I do? So you get into first order control issues where you can make a stock go negative inadvertently. It's not supposed to, negative people or something, because of the selection of time step relative to
call them
what
economists.
So this is a whole, and the it freaks out a lot of economists in that they will think a flow equation and synthetic flow data generated by a system dynamics model is the same thing as flow data from some data set somewhere. Okay. So like, weekly sales, the flow of weekly sales into inventory. Okay. Well, if you model that in Ravel or Stella or Vensim or whatever, they're not going to be the same, even though the concepts are, sales. It's a flow, because weekly sales are Monday sales plus Tuesday sales plus Wednesday sales. So there's a stock in there. You're accumulating something. And if you just go to daily sales instead of weekly, now we're making in some sense the time step smaller. Well, that's 8 o'clock sales plus 9 o'clock sales plus 10. There's a stock in there. And then we'll just hourly sales. Okay. 801 sales plus 802 sales. You're trying to be infinitesimally small steps, right? So the concepts are not identical, and you have to stop and say, it's a model. It's not real.
Yeah. But
So
it's the same.
it's an artifact of the fact you're using a discrete machine to model a continuous flow, right?
But
so
then
long story short, there's a whole lot of issues here, let alone one last point. The selection of your integration algorithm, whether it's an Adams, Bashforth, or Runge-Kutta, Euler, or whatever, there's a lot going on there too. Like if you're using noise in your model, and it has to have a particular characteristic. If it's a Poisson distribution versus some other, distribution that you've estimated, you're not randomly doing it. No pun intended, not randomly using it, but you've taken care to select a probability distribution for your random variates that relate to some problem. Euler will leave it alone. Other integration methods will change the characteristic of the noise. So again, it's tricky business as to,
But so much of this has been handled by mathematicians in the very first instance. So, like because economists always say, "How do I choose the right time step?" I say, "Look, you don't, because you've got what's called an adaptive Runge-Kutta algorithm, and that works out what the rate of change is at some point on a dynamic path. And if there's very little change for this particular range of times, it takes a big step. If you're having a turning point in the system, it'll take small steps." So all this stuff has been done by mathematicians already. And it means rather, like people often seem to worry that if I abandon discrete time, am I going to have to, work really carefully and working out the size of steps? No, you can forget about thinking about time at all, apart from defining your equations as functions of time. And then it reduces the amount of work you've got to do. It doesn't increase it. And I think there's a bit of fear amongst post-Keynesian economists. It's going to be really hard to learn this stuff. It's a challenge to some extent, but it actually makes your life a damn sight easier. And I'll give one example of discrete time modeling. I tried to model an agricultural economy with discrete time, and I wanted to have workers consuming what they produced in that time period, whereas the harvest was over a 1 year or one harvest routine. And I ended up with equations where you continued having to loop back and expand the logic. My set of equations covered the floor of a garage, and I gave up. Whereas continuous time, it's much, much simpler.
So further confusing people, economists in particular, is if you look at the old Samuelson's multiplier accelerator paper, if you look at Baumel's economic dynamics book, RGD Allen's books, when they do difference equation stuff, you'll properly see that the plots, have this sort of like bar graph kind of shapes, because nothing happens and something happens, nothing happens and something happens. That's the proper way to do it. If you look at modern post-Keynesian stuff, you'll see that they're using discrete time, but they connect smoothly the dots. And that's a continuous presentation of a discrete, what's rightly a discrete modeling output. I think it's probably simply the algorithm just does that. The plotting program just does that rather than a conscious thought. But again, it's misleading. It's like, well, are you doing continuous time modeling? Oh no, but you got this smooth, So there's a lot of confusion because they're not trained. Economists are not trained to do continuous time dynamic modeling.
And they should be, yeah.
Everybody, make sure you are in the chat, hit the notification bell, subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Ask your questions. I will allow that. I have strict rules. I know Mike points that out quite a bit, but I do like questions in the show.
Steve and I are afraid of Ty.
Yeah,
being
that's
scolded.
it's I feel like Donald Trump. I got a question here as a statement. Ty, the commercials in the middle of the conversation are more than annoying. It makes it very hard to concentrate on the details of the discussion. Unfortunately, if unless people start sending me a bunch of super chats, it's $50 a month for Restream. And that makes these streams where I have guests really, really easy to do. The only alternative way is to do it on OBS, which means I have to pick like Zoom or Google Meets to get the guests on and coordinate that way. This way is completely integrated. And I've found the ads. So ads last month, I just came under my target. So I came at 45. So it only cost me $5. Right. So the ads kind of serve that purpose, or else I'm out $50 a month. Right. And I'm not exactly wealthy yet. I hope I am one day, but I'm not super wealthy yet. So that's why we have the ads.
The other thing, of course, YouTube inserts the ads in there unless you pay for premium. And frankly, probably in my experience, pay for premium. It's worth it even in watching, YouTube videos or watching movies and stuff. Whether you pay, I think I forgot what it's about $25 a month, I think, something like that, and you
I
get
think
an
it's even
ad-free
less.
experience. Sorry.
I think it's
I think
even
it
less than that.
might less than that. I think it's actually one of the few things on computing I'll say is good value, because we watch YouTube so much these days. Pay about $20, and you don't have to put up with advertisements.
And your favorite content creators get a portion of that premium.
We do indeed. Yeah, it
So
comes through to us. Yeah.
if you want to do that as well. So that's just kind of the reasoning behind it. It's I don't mind that, and I'm sure Mike and Steve would love to get paid to be on this live stream, but at the bare minimum, we want to keep a break-even
And the
situation.
other side of things is that YouTube won't advertise this unless you make it commercial. It's like one reason my YouTube audition's gone up by a factor of 6 in the last year is that Jordan, the guy who does my marketing for me, turned on commercials again. And I turned them off because I was getting so few views. I thought, why annoy people? I'll get the commercials out of the way as well. But it then meant that YouTube promotes my work even less. Now they've got advertisements inside that people have got to put up with ads unless they pay premium. But the result is YouTube further promotes it, so I can get a larger audience out of this stuff. So
It's very true. So last week, Steve, I always get Steve to plug this live stream on his YouTube channel, which has gotten really large. And last week he forgot or got busy. Last week I also turned my ads to high. So old heretic, you might be noticing that. And I had my third highest total live stream since it's been on my channel.
Yeah.
And that's an indication that YouTube will bump videos that allow them to show more ads because they're in the business.
In that case, this is just newspapers. One of the way the politicians used to annoy journalists when they didn't like them in the newspapers, they'd say that they'd talk about using a newspaper to wrap up fish and chips and stuff like that. But they also pointed out that newspapers aren't in the business of selling news; they're selling advertisements, and they attract people to look at the advertisements by putting stories around the advertisements. Now, if you don't have the advertisements coming in, the newspaper won't get published. So we desperately need those. Advertisements are part of why you see this stuff, because YouTube uses us as a way of selling ads to the rest of the people. So it's a pain in the butt, but it works.
Speaking about making money or what have you, so I'm in the midst of negotiating with my university about Rising from the Ashes, our online system dynamics program.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to happen from done by our complex systems lab staff. And we have teed up, potentially on the order of 17 to 20 online courses that'll be either nuts and bolts, how do you do it classes, or domain area applications of system dynamics, including economics.
Mm-hmm.
So that's still in the negotiation stage. All the people that decimated our program are gone. They're off at other universities wrecking their programs.
Oh, yeah, but this is the management you're talking about, are you?
I'm sorry?
Management staff were decimating your programs?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When we were running it, we were bringing in like $400,000 of additional tuition to the school every year. And then that caught the attention of the administration. They said, we'll run it. We'll take that over. Thank you. And they
crashed it.
And now they're all gone. All those people, they're off doing other things to other places.
Thank God they're improving some other part of the world. Yeah.
Right. So the new administration has said, yes, please do this. So we're chit-chatting about if we go ahead and do this, like, what's the deal, right? So in terms of, because people are like, I'm not going to create courses just the university takes all the money, So, but stay tuned. We might have a nice program like if any of this stuff we're chit-chatting about is interesting, how do I learn how to do it? Well, we might, and these would be inexpensive. You're not going to get a badge. You won't get like a degree or anything like that, but they'll be, I don't know what they're going to, $149 or something for the course.
I want a degree for that $149.
You get a badge. No, you get a badge, man. You don't need no stinking badges. Apparently, you get badges. I guess are a big deal these days. So
okay, let's get back to some questions here. This one's from Frank. Do you think we'd be better off measuring real goods and services produced if we create excess wages? If we create excess wages can go up
excess
in order
wages,
yeah. Too few, then wages fall to meet production. Steve, do you want to handle this one?
Okay. Well, we do measure goods and services.
You need to be enthusiastic. Frank is a valued viewer on our channel. I've already lost Tony. I don't want to lose Frank too.
Yeah, you got to get Tony back, mate. We all keep on hassling you about it. Go and kiss and make up. But yeah, it's we do measure real goods and services, and like one of the hassles with neoclassical economics is it leaves out the monetary system, and it leaves out nominal prices. It tries to work everything in terms of real goods and services, and that's one of its weaknesses because it tries to portray capitalism as a barter system when it's anything but. It's a monetary system. So you have to look at the monetary dynamics that turn up in the system as well. And yes, that's something which is, that's one thing I encourage with using the modeling side of Ravel is to work with nominal quantities as well as with real quantities. So the Godly tables help us handle the financial dynamics. The flowchart helps us handle the real dynamics. We integrate the two together, and we've got both modeling of the monetary system where prices are measured and wages are in money terms, and then you've got the real physical output being produced as well, which the monetary system motivates. So we need both to be able to handle the economy well. And we do measure real goods and services, but we need to have that monetary side included as well.
Mike, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think system dynamics, this is really Jay Forrester, really relied more on the physical side of things as the important thing rather than the price side of things. Not that money wasn't, or finance wasn't important, but that the real side of the economy was where the action took place, where all the leverage points were and what have you. So, if we're modeling plant and equipment, it's called capital. And the outflow, if it's in money terms, is depreciation. And if it's in real terms, is capital discards. And we model both. So it's certainly possible to do it. Certainly a good idea to do it. I still don't know whether I agree with Jay or not on that. But that's, that might have set the system dynamics community off in a particular direction. I'm not entirely sure about that. I hadn't really thought about it till today. But
I think it's a big issue, mate, because like I got the same. Richard Goodwin wrote to me when I was doing my PhD on Minsky, and he tried to encourage me not to look at the monetary system. And again, the same sort of argument. It's the real world system that matters. But money motivates the capitalist system. If you don't have it in there, you don't understand it. And ironically, one thing about Goodwin is, I wish I'd met him. He sounds like a lovely human being. He was very, very generous to me as a student when he sent this letter to me out of the blue. But as well as trying to encourage me not to include the monetary system in my own modeling, advice I ignored, obviously, he also told me that his family went bankrupt during the 1930s because his grandfather owned a bank, and the grandfather personally paid out all the depositors to the bank just before Roosevelt announced the bank holiday. So as well as saying, he said he did an econometric study for his PhD of the role of money between the First and Second World War and found no particular role. I don't know how the hell he reached that result. I think it's bad econometrics that would have caused it, because that's clearly a point that I say, the crisis was caused by a collapse in the monetary system. But he both told me not to include the monetary system and then told me a way in which the monetary system devastated his own family in the same letter.
He apparently was also like a wine connoisseur. And when he was at Cambridge, whatever college he was at, he was in charge of the wine cellar.
Had to be right. He's also an artist, apparently extremely good artist. So a
So
true,
these people, like Kenneth
true
Boulding was like a concert level pianist and should have been a great economist. You know?
who's that? Sorry?
Kenneth Boulding. Yeah.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yeah.
These are some of the good people too. I mean, it's partially having a
great quotes from Boulding too. Just great.
Yeah.
He's
He's a systems guy. Yeah. Did I tell you my Ken Boulding story?
Go for it.
So I was at the Dallas Convention Center where they held the Republican National Convention one year. This gives you the idea how giant this auditorium thing is. And the American Economic Association meetings were held there. This is like in the 80s. And I'm in this sea of 10,000 economists, everybody's elbow to elbow. And I'm looking for the registration table, big R for Radzicki.
Yeah.
And suddenly the crowd parts and there's Ken Boulding standing there. And he was kind of older at the time, kind of little. And I said, "Are you Professor Boulding?" He says, "Yeah." I said, I'm Mike Radzicki. I love your stuff. He thanked me. And I said, "I'm just looking for my registration, whatever area." And he goes, "Me too." Yeah. And I go, "Well, you got to be over by the B." So I kind of took his arm because he was kind of old and frail at the time. And I just plowed through the crowd, and I got him to his line to stand for other than the B's. I said, "I'm going to go over, Professor, to my to the R's now. Have a good day," or whatever. But yeah, he was cool. I liked him. Like the stuff.
So we have closed the poll now. So it's pretty much our viewers are supporting a minimum wage policy, and I think we've kind of covered everything. It's pretty obvious that the three of us are going to support it in some shape or fashion. But I do want to try to get to we're down to our last 20 minutes. So I do want to try to get to a few more questions here. One from Ralph: doesn't aggregate minimum wage overlook the significance of individual worker productivity? I'll start with you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very common argument. And like I copped it when I was teaching, of course, because you were all paid the same wages. If you're an associate professor or a senior lecturer, you got the same wage as the other senior lecturers. But there are massive differences in teaching quality as well, must be said. I think it comes down to the issue of solidarity. In workers, you want to lift everybody up. If you're going to try to get more performance out of somebody, you do performance monitoring of them. You don't think you're going to pay a higher wage and get an amateur person to do better quality work. So, I mean, I don't care how much you paid some of the neoclassical staff at my department, they'd still give you lousy output. So it isn't necessarily the wage that motivates the behavior. I see it at the class level. It's workers versus capitalists on that front. And I want to get a decent standard of living for the workers. And if the capitalists, some of them can't manage to compete at that level, then, as Singapore said, if you can't pay the wages here, leave. And the result of that has been dramatically improving the quality of the firms the workers work for, and that's where you get your real rise in productivity. Again, there's so many. If you look at process workers and stuff like that, there's no way to distinguish because the work rhythm is set by the machines they're working on. And if you have somebody who can't keep up with the machines, you can't pay them a higher wage to make them do it. You've got to either retrain them or move them somewhere else. But I don't see individual worker productivity as being a major factor in capitalism anyway, generally speaking. It's the technology and the machines you build and the workers fit into that in terms of unskilled labor. Getting an unskilled worker to work harder doesn't give you higher output. It's the machinery and the overall technology of the firm they're locked into that gives you a level of productivity. I'd like to ban the word labor productivity from the lexicon, because when you look at what labor productivity actually means, it really means how productive the machines are that the workers are managing. It's not the individual effort of the worker itself. Himself.
So you're saying our human beings, our watts are not increasing per 8-hour work shift year on year.
If you want to get a really productive worker, grab a slave from the Roman Empire, and you'll find they work a damn sight, put down some more energy than we do these days. So it's not the energy input or the worker. It's the technology, and that's what's going to give you a rise in productivity.
Mike, anything you want to add on to
Yeah,
Ralph's question?
I think circling back. So we want the minimum wage is really all about, at the entry level, at the lowest of the unskilled level. Not everybody is going to. I had a professor in graduate school who would always say, "Go ahead, give everybody in society a PhD. Somebody still has to collect the garbage." That there has to be a high enough floor where people can just starting out can live a decent life, and then they can go from there. Climb as high as you can climb, but let's have a minimum standard. Now, whether you use the minimum wage to do that, or there's a better way to do it with an incomes policy or what have you, that's a very different issue. But yeah, if you have workers who feel they're treated unfairly, they're pissed off, they're in pain, psychological pain, physical pain, so they self-medicate, all these different things. These folks are not going to be very productive, right? So the more we can get people to buy into whatever they're doing, it's not just a job, it's a career. I'm treated fairly. I see an opportunity to advance, this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I think you're going to have a much healthier economy, better firms, more innovation, stuff like that. But again, how you go about it, whether it's minimum wage or something else, another matter.
We're going to go to the next question, try to bounce through a few more. This one is from XDem68. Nuance about minimum wage. How about if the arguments, especially from neoclassicals and Austrians, were to accept we workers are humans and not abstract things to use? Mike, I'll let you try.
Yeah, just right out of Karl Marx, but he was absolutely right on that one. Commodification of everything. You screw up Christmas and make that into something commodified, and you treat workers like a lump of coal that's an input into the Steve's famous Cobb Douglas production function. You use it up and you throw it out. But people are not like wood, coal, or a machine, right? They're human beings. They have aspirations and blah, blah, all that stuff. So yeah, XDem68 is 100% right. We should treat our workers as human beings and as positively, not as, because you get into the old theory X, theory Y, and theory Z theories of management. If what theory X is that workers are slackers that need to be watched all the time, or they'll be screwing off and whatever. They must be disciplined and all that. As soon as you're going with that model, forget about it, right? So then you get into co-ops and worker-owned, profit sharing, and all these sorts of ways to try and soften the capitalist system and make workers part of the winning. Right, not just commodified,
Whereas, I mean, one of the worst things about the American system, there's lots of bad things about it, is the lousy wages they pay people in service industries like waiters and waitresses. And I remember, that's why tipping is so important in America, because people they're being paid a minimum wage, which is not a livable wage. So I remember very vividly being at a conference in Florida. Not actually in Miami, another town in Florida, with a whole bunch of people from their third world countries. It was a conference of progressive religious people, and for some reason I got invited along. And the people, they're all from third world countries, so they got the bill and they were going to leave no tip. And I said, look, if you don't leave a tip, the workers here don't get a living wage. They won't be able to afford enough to eat tonight. And one of the women one of the service waitresses heard me say that, and she came over to the table and said, this person is completely right. I think the wage they were paying was $3.78, and this is in the early 2000s.
It's shockingly low.
Incredible. You can't live on it. I mean, 40 hours a week, you'd come out with less than $120. And that's living on the streets material in America. So what it means is capitalists are outsourcing the risk of the business to the workers, because they're paying so little that if no customers turn up, they don't lose a great deal of money, and the workers take the risk because they've got to go around to perform and get people to pay them large tips, and it's actually you've outsourced the risk to the workers. And if there's anything about capitalism which gives you what should be your attitude toward risks. The ones that should take the risk of, losing money out of a business should be the business owners, not the workers inside it.
You guys are sounding like a bunch of dirty communists right
There you go.
now.
Well, I'm a clean
About
communist,
the
but that's another
free
story.
market and libertarian, I can do it on my own.
Yeah.
Social Darwinism.
Maybe call it anti-social Darwinism.
One last question. This is again from Zoe. Actually, she warned me about this. This is more for Steve, but maybe Mike can chime in too. Not minimum wage related. Sorry. Please, could you walk us through what happens to deposits when government bonds are sold? First on primary markets and then on the secondary markets.
Okay.
Are deposits destroyed?
Okay. In the first case, when the auctions are performed, so the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, pays interest in existing bonds, and it's required by law, not by accounting, but by laws, to issue bonds equivalent to the deficit plus interest on existing bonds. Now, the process of government spending more than it takes back in taxation actually creates deposits on one side of the bank's ledger, and it creates reserves on the other side of the bank's ledger. So the balancing item for private money creation is loans create deposits, but in the case of government spending, its reserves create deposits. So the act of running a deficit creates those reserves, and then when the auctions are made, and like in America's case, there are about 300 auctions per year, virtually an auction a day, and at the moment, the level of reserves, outstanding reserves in America, courtesy of quantitative easing, is roughly 10% of GDP. So you've got 300 auctions going on there each year. A trivial fraction of GDP in terms of bond issues is made at each auction, and there's already reserves that exist that mean that when the bonds are put up for auction, to buy them, you've got to have an account at the central bank, which we call reserves. So if you succeed in the auction, you transfer funds from your reserve account to the Treasury's account at the central bank, and then you get the bonds in recompense for the transfer of reserves to the Treasury's account. Now, that all those operations take place on the asset side of the private banking's system's ledger. So reserves are an asset of the private banks. The bonds they buy are an asset of the private banks. You have an asset swap, and that changes the asset that backs the money that's being created by the deficit, but doesn't actually access money at all. Now, when you sell on the secondary market, then what happens there? The banks and the primary dealers who bought the bonds in the first instance, and therefore have bonds as an asset on their books, when they sell them to non-banks, then the way non-banks pay for them is through the deposit accounts that non-banks have at banks. So if you want to buy $100,000 worth of bonds, you tell the bank, reduce my deposit by $100,000. That reduces your liability to me, and give me an equivalent amount of assets that you currently own, $100,000 worth of bonds. So when the secondary market occurs, assets of the banking sector fall, and so do the liabilities, and that destroys money. So deposits are destroyed by sales in the secondary market, and it's one reason, if I had any influence over government policy, I'd pretty much ban the secondary sales by the private banks. I wouldn't even sell them bonds in the first place. I'd sell the bonds to the central bank, quote unquote, and then and let the reserves mount up at the private banks, pay them interest on the reserves, so they get paid some money for maintaining the payment system. And then if you want to reduce economic activity at any point in the economy, the central bank would sell bonds to the non-bank private sector, and that would take money out of circulation and slow down economic activity. So I'd rather rearrange the system that way than go with the one we have at the moment, where we basically give the banking sector the license to destroy money created by the government.
Mike, anything you want to add on to that?
Well, yeah. So number one, yeah, Steve is spot on. Number two, I'd have to keep up with him, I'd have to be modeling it and making sure all the double entry stuff in my mind is clear. I'm sure it's clear in Steve's mind. Yeah. Number three, I was imagining me repeating Steve's explanation to my buddies back in Wisconsin at the tavern. And I would have, they would have pulled my underwear over my head at some point, because to the average person, they hear Steve's very good. He walked A to Z, and good for Zoe. Good for Zoe for asking.
Yeah.
Great stuff. But this is why people don't understand. They think about the national government like their house, all the fallacy of composition stuff, because following that presentation requires a hell of a lot of work. You got to get out a pencil and paper and think about it. And nobody wants to do that. So this is why nobody understands economics.
There you go. Well, nobody understands me anyway. Okay.
Well, we're at the end of the 2 hours here. It was a great stream. A lot of questions. My system. So I've been monitoring.
The sound effects are cool.
Yeah, the sound effects are, and they're going to get more intense and more irritating week by week because now I have the power to. I've been watching my system, so I download this software if anybody's interested. It's called HW Info, and so if you look at your task manager, you can see, I think your GPU temperature, your CPU temperature. This reads out all your sensors on your motherboard and any peripherals connected through buses on your motherboard. And I haven't even, I actually might have to put a heater beside my my tower to keep it warm enough, because it's been operating so smoothly. This is great. This is 6 years in the making. I don't know why I didn't do this sooner. I don't understand what took me so long to do this. There's another reason too. So I have this I call it GDP dynamics, and it's the system dynamic model. And I put it in Python, so it takes infrared data, and then it does a bunch of sweeps. And I would run it on my old laptop, and it would sound like a jet engine was going off. Like it was I could see the laptop lifting up because the fans were blowing so hard it almost became a hovercraft. I
you can't put it on your lap. Your laptop on your lap is too hot.
Yeah. And so I actually did tested that out on the new system too, and I didn't go up in cores, so I've got a Ryzen 5, so it's still only 6 cores, but what it does is it doubles the threading. So cores are like your chefs in your CPU. The threading, if you have more threading, is like the not the sous chefs, but the prep cook. So the cook can use 2 hands now and multitask each core. So I went up in threading, and that makes a huge difference. So it's just I'm really, really, really happy about that. Steve, I was actually going to ask you off the air what your system was, because you've always had a nice clear. You run on a laptop all the time, right?
No, because I'm not particularly happy with it. I bought an HP laptop with an i9 processor, 32 gig of RAM, and 2 terabyte hard disk. So it's got a fair bit of grunt to it. But whether it's Windows 11 or whatever else it is, it keeps on falling over on me. So I think it's actually Windows 11 that's being the dog. But like I've got a hell of a lot of processing power in this machine, and it's liquid cooled, yada yada yada. So yeah.
Oh, liquid cool. Okay, so you're on a tower right now. What are
I'm
the
on a
specs?
tower.
What are the specs of what CPU are you running?
An i9.
i9. Okay, and what's your GPU? Do you know?
Good question. I've forgotten what it is, but it's high tech. It's high end. So it's I could check the box and tell you, because it's got
fine.
a transparent case.
Your 32 gigs of RAM?
Yep.
Okay, so when I bought mine, I have my second channel. I'll be sticking. RAM prices are so expensive right now, but I'll stick in another, because I'm on 16 gigabytes right now. But I'll plug in and get my 32.
Get it done before the Strait of Hormuz totally closes and we no longer have any chips being manufactured.
Yeah, and what else am I going to do? Oh yeah, so you can get your SDD drives connect directly to your motherboard. I'm still with the SATA, they call it, so I'm wired
SATA,
to the
SATA, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm limited to 500 megabytes per second. So I'll upgrade that as well. That's going to be one of my upgrades. Mike, what about you? What are you running?
I have no idea. All I can remember is when I got my initial Macintoshes in 1985, we went from 128K to 512 to a Fat Mac, and we thought, how are you going to ever use all that memory? It was absurd sounding. And yet here we are.
Well, that's the end of the show. We'll be back next week. We do have some guests. I know Dave's got some has a guest lined up. Mike, we've got your guy. I think May 1st we'll have him on. So make sure you guys show up for that one. Other than that, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Okay.
We could be saying goodbye if I press the right buttons.
I hope you have. I was just seeing us on screen. There we go. We've gone on.
You are now relearning economics.